Kia ora, I am Dr. C. Rotmann. I am the New Zealand operating agent of the Hard to Reach Energy Users Annex of the Users Technology Collaboration Program by the International Energy Agency. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight in our international research collaboration. First up, I'm going to have to just very quickly highlight that the users TCP, under which this research sits, is functionally and legally autonomous from the IEA Secretariat in Paris. So, our Hard to Reach Energy Users Annex followed on from a 8-year research collaboration with 14 countries around the world, where we studied behavior change in energy efficiency and demand side management. It was called Task 24. And during this research, we found that those we call hard to reach energy users are an incredibly important audience to focus on, which is why we created this whole new annex in 2019. So our definition of hard to reach energy users is very broad. You can see it here. Most people think of them as low income households who live in energy or fuel poverty, but we found it's actually a lot more complex than that. For example, energy users who are hard to reach can also be those very high income, high consuming households who have a lot more potential to change, but potentially don't care because they can afford their bills. Or it can be building operators in commercial buildings who have a lot of power over their energy consumption, but may not feel empowered by their organizational leadership to save energy. So our hypothesis when we started this research was that over 1/3 of energy users in the world were hard to reach. We've recently written a book, an accidental lockdown book, on characterizing these hard to reach audiences, looking at over 1,000 different publications, doing a bit literature review, and we found it is probably more like 3/4 of energy users who fall under especially this broad definition that we have here. For example, 60% of commercial and residential buildings are rented. There's obviously a big split incentive issue with the landlords making the retrofit decisions and tenants paying the utility bills. Small to medium businesses form over 99% of all businesses in the world. They're regarded as some of the hardest to reach energy users, especially now that a lot of them are running out of their households due to lockdown and the pandemic. And of course, vulnerable households are not just identified by their income status, but there are also those who suffer from various compounding intersectionalities like minority status due to gender, age, race, ethnicity, or disability, living in geographically remote locations, or being otherwise stigmatized, criminalized, or illegitimized by society for whatever reasons. And so we really thought about our shared goal, which is to identify, define, and prioritize hard to reach audiences, design, measure, and share effective strategies to engage those audiences to achieve energy demand response and climate targets while meeting access, equity, and energy service needs, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the biggest problem is that the terminology alone is an issue, and we actually wrote about that in detail in quite some depth in our literature review, where we looked at all the different terms and definitions. And hard to reach is obviously a very common one, but it seems to put the onus on the energy users being hard to reach rather than us, the so-called behavior changers, as we have termed them, who are actually charged with motivating and engaging them in energy and conservation activities that meet their needs and that overcome the various barriers that they're facing. And so our goal is to help identify and characterize them better and in more depth, and to figure out how we can help behavior changes to best engage them, whilst also serving really important equity and energy justice needs. Because we found in this Venn diagram that we all agree that equity is a hugely important goal that is underpinning the motivation for this research. But of course, unless you're actually willing to address the structural issues of inequity and energy injustice, you're not going to really get there. And so it's a very complex topic that we're starting to tackle. We have some brilliant collaborators around the world, including the Fuel Poverty Research Network, with 3 financially participating countries, the US, Sweden, and New Zealand, 2 co-financing countries in Canada and the UK, and we're very grateful to all of our collaborators. So we have a project partner in the US called the Sea Change Institute, who have co-created a research framework, a strategic design process called the ABCDE Building Blocks of Behavior Change. And this is what we're testing and validating in field research pilots during this annex. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our year one deliverables, which sit under these following steps and building blocks. So I'm just going to leave this slide to provide you some links to some of our reports. I may see quite a few of you at the Behave conference that's coming up in April. We have a special workshop there on the Friday, and we're also presenting 4 different papers there. So some of our key findings in year one were that, yes, the most commonly mentioned how to reach audiences that we found during the over 50 stakeholder interviews in 5 countries that we did, and a big survey that we did from where we got, I think, 150 responses from 20 countries, was low-income households, renters, and small to medium businesses or enterprises. However, we also found, especially with our literature review, that the hard to reach audiences that probably have the greatest energy saving potential are actually high income households, landlords, both commercial and residential, and commercial building operators. The hard to reach audiences that were of most interest to non-energy stakeholders, who are often those really important trusted middle actors that you need to be able to identify and engage them, disabled people, stigmatized people, and geographically isolated people. As I said, our audience size estimates showed that it's actually a lot more than the 1/3 of energy users that we originally thought. It's more like 2/3 or 3/4. And the COVID-19 impact has been really massive, particularly on the most vulnerable households, on renters, and also on small to medium enterprises. Some of the biggest research gaps that we identified were in the commercial sector outside of office buildings, which is often like a catch-all cry for the commercial sector. Obviously, small to medium enterprises, looking at multiple benefits and also multiple impacts. Certain demographics, the demographic data is just like really underrepresented, and there's not enough work on psychographics, and particularly on audience needs assessments, even though the barriers are usually quite well explored. So these audiences are not just hard to reach, they're also underserved and under-researched by us behavior changers in industry, government, and academia. And we really want to highlight that energy justice, inequity, and stigma are key themes that need to be addressed much more urgently, and on this, focusing on these target audiences. So very quickly, also some impacts we found of COVID-19. About 300 million people worldwide have already or will lose their jobs, but the share, of course, is very unequal. Those already most vulnerable are usually the most impacted, with structural inequalities really exacerbating the problem. For example, even though New Zealand did incredibly well with our COVID elimination, 90% of the jobs that were lost in New Zealand were female workers. And 30% of mothers who have lost their jobs have cited childcare responsibilities as the primary reason in the US. And also, it needs to be highlighted that the working hour losses in 2020 were actually 4 times greater than during the global financial crisis in 2009. So the impact has been insanely large. Obviously, that also means that the number of vulnerable households and small businesses has increased. In some countries like the US, drastically. Nearly half of the low-income workers who lost their jobs are still unemployed. 3 to 40 million Americans are looking at getting evicted. Lockdowns obviously also meant increased home energy bills. The low-income households with children were found to be hit the hardest. Some energy use was increasing by 75%. Of course, some of that is offset by the reduced mobility index, but not all. And it's also showed that behavioral changes were super important in our COVID response, but they're not possible for everyone, particularly those key essential workers who are often the most vulnerable. And it's overwhelmingly women in low paid positions that fall under these categories. And they, of course, have the added childcare bills, not to mention potentially exposing their family to COVID. And that all leads to a huge increase in mental distress. which has, of course, been further exacerbated by the horrific winter spikes which are seen in the Northern Hemisphere, and lockdown fatigue coinciding with the major holidays, more indoor gatherings, and, of course, the politicization of public health measures such as mask wearing and social distancing. And again, one of the things that I think we really need to point out is that stigma has been understudied. We will present a paper on some of the empirical data that we found in our participating countries at the Behave conference, and hopefully also at the ECEEE summer study. And I'd just like to highlight that in year 2, we are going to focus on a cross-country case study comparison, and we're really keen to hear case studies from other countries and disseminate them via this international research annex. So please contact me and get in touch if you have any good case studies, both in the residential and the non-residential sector, and I'd love to showcase it and delve into it in some more depth. Kia ora.